The German defenders were now firing at point-blank range. And the Royal Marines, crowded on the deck of Vindictive, were being slaughtered. At this critical moment, the commander of one of the cruiser's escorts, the converted ferry Daffodil, saw the difficulty she was in and nudged his bows against Vindictive's side and pushed her alongside the mole. At last, the landing ramps went down and the Royal Marines could start to fight their way ashore. One officer, seeing a platoon of men crouched close to a ramp, ordered them ashore, but no one moved. They were all dead, cut down by a single machine gun. But despite the German fire, the boarding parties on Vindictive began to get ashore. The men on her two escorts were unable to disembark because of the height of the sea wall, so those from Daffodil clambered aboard Vindictive so as to use her landing ramps. As the landing parties came over the top of the wall, they were met by a storm of bullets which cut down many of them. An attempt was made to rush the tip of the mole, but every single man in the attack became a casualty. The Germans were firing from well-fortified positions, and it seemed almost impossible to winkle them out. From the foretop of Vindictive, a section of Royal Marines was manning Lewis guns to provide covering fire. One by one, the men were cut down, until only Sergeant Norman Finch remained. Despite his wounds, he continued to fire on the German positions, and was one of the 11 Victoria Crosses awarded that day, the most ever during a single action. Gradually, however, the desperate gallantry of the Marines seemed to be having some effect. The fire from some of the German positions was slowing, and they were so preoccupied with fighting off the assault that they would be unable to turn on the block ships, which would go in behind them. While this desperate struggle continued, another threat to the Marines became apparent. One which could abort the whole mission. A battalion of German infantry on bicycles was seen approaching the mole. If they got onto it, the Marines would be overwhelmed. The submarine C-3 appeared in the nick of time and headed towards the arches of the mole. Without a shot being fired directly at her, the commander rammed the submarine into position. Before the Germans on the mole had realized exactly what was going on, the 7 men of the crew leapt into a skiff. But most were wounded by heavy fire before they could escape to the waiting motor launch. "12 minutes later, the submarine exploded, blowing a 30-yard hole in the mole. Any German hope of reinforcing their troops was now at an end. With the Germans on the mole fully tied down, it was time for the crucial block ships to move in. 3 elderly cruisers, Thetis, Intrepid, and Iphigenia, had each been packed with 1,500 tons of concrete and equipped with scuttling charges. Manned by volunteer crews, they now slipped in behind the mole and headed for the entrance. Seeing this new threat, the Germans in the port itself concentrated their fire on the 3 ships. Thetis was hit particularly severely and began to fill with water, so her commander had to scuttle her outside the entrance. Despite point-blank German fire, the other two ships succeeded in entering the canal and were successfully scuttled. Launches were standing by to rescue the crews of the block ships, and these now moved in under heavy fire. As they moved off with the survivors, klaxons sounded to signal the end of the operation, and the Royal Marines on the mole began to fall back to HMS Vindictive. Amazingly, the cruiser was able to get away from the mole and limped back to England. Her part of the raid had been a triumphant success, but a success which had been bought at a very high price. Of the 1,300 Royal Navy and Royal Marine volunteers who took part in the action, over 600 were killed or wounded. Sadly, the two block ships which had been intended to close the entrance at Ostend were unable to reach it and had to be scuttled a mile outside it. But a month later, the Vindictive, this time loaded with concrete as a block ship, managed to complete the job. But the dawn at Zeebrugge showed that 2 of the 3 block ships were well in the entrance, sunk across the main channel. The sheer audacity of the raid was a welcome boost for the morale of the British public, at a time when the successes of the German storm troops on the Western Front looked to be close to breaking through the Allied line. The Zeebrugge raid, with its intricate coordination of landing forces with the block ships and the submarine used to isolate the mole, was the biggest special operation of World War I. Roger Keyes, the man who conceived it, was to go on to plan similar assaults when he became Director of Combined Operations in 1940. In this, as in so many other ways, World War I foreshadowed many of the developments which were to be exploited in the Second World War. And even more spectacularly, it pioneered many of the weapons which have revolutionized today's battlefield.